morning. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Today we're in conversation with Phil Seymour, president of the Aviation Consulting Group, IBA. Phil's in the UK right now. Phil, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for the invite. I look forward to being in conversation with you. Thank you.
IBA has long experience. You guys have covered the aviation industry for a long time. You're appraisers. You analyze the data. You've got lots of other areas going on. As everybody knows, the industry is waiting for the new normal. As we sit here at the end of July, what's the big picture where the industry stands overall, and kind of give us an idea of what you see happening the rest of the year?
Yeah, well, thanks, Matt. I think if I just take an opportunity just to mention IBA, because we are there's 60 of us at IBA, and we do come from all sectors of aviation. Many of us have worked for airlines, MROs, and leasing companies, and some have worked for financial institutions. So that base gives us plenty of experience. And right now, I think we're aiming to be as positive as possible, but we really can't see right now the best way out of the current situation. And I suppose on the one hand that may be disappointing, but on the other, you've only got to look and talk to the CEOs of airlines, and actually they haven't got a clear picture yet. So given that virtually our whole industry depends on people getting onto aeroplanes, whether that's for tourism, business, and the freight side of the business as well, needs to be considered. Until we get a much clearer idea of the government regulations and how things can be lifted, then it's still a fairly, I suppose it's an unclear view of exactly where we're standing. We do look back at previous recessions and downturns and aim to take some of that evidence. But I would say right now it's still not clear exactly how we're going to get out of the COVID-19 travel situation.
Well, everybody, I mean, and we'll skip around a little bit on the questions that we talked about, but I mean, you raise a good point, because everybody looks back at 2008, financial crisis, look at SARS, et cetera, and everybody from IATA, ICAO, airlines, MROs, lessors, everybody that I've spoken with, the one word that they use is unprecedented. And I mean, it's interesting because, the problem is I actually wrote an opinion piece about this. IATA, I think, has done a great job of really, Alexander Dejuniak has really tried to push hard, really tried to make the points that this is not an aviation problem, it's a medical problem, it's a virus problem, but it's affecting not just aviation, but the entire world. And yeah. But I just don't think, that they understand also that people don't feel comfortable being packed into a 737 or an A320 and sharing the middle seat with a whole bunch of other people. Cramming an airplane full of people is not really a way to promote confidence in the industry.
Yeah, and I think that's the dilemma that we're all facing, even with our own families. I mean, it's one thing, we're thinking, do we get on a plane and go down to the Mediterranean for a couple of hours, or ideally we'd like to see family who live in Vancouver, but that means sitting on an aircraft for 10 hours, and that's probably after sitting in an airport for 3 hours as well. So I think that whole sort of chain of things that have to happen to get onto the aircraft is still not absolutely clear. I was talking to a colleague yesterday who did fly into Europe from London and arrived 3 hours ahead of time. But when he got airside, there was none of the toilets were available, and there was one facility that was selling bottled water. So, it's silly things like that which really we've taken for granted. That whole travel experience. It's exciting as a family as soon as you leave the house. Getting into a taxi or driving to the airport, that is all part of the holiday. But I think that experience is really going to be something where families are really going to be considering, do they really want that hassle? And then really, if we're looking at the situation over here in the UK, several of the Mediterranean resorts have opened up to UK visitors. But now there's some local lockdowns in the Barcelona area. So, how sure can you be that your 2-week vacation is actually going to be something that you can enjoy? So, I think those considerations, as well as that middle seat factor, really will. Again, it's probably untested. Some people probably won't mind, but I'm sure those who are concerned or feeling vulnerable, it's just going to be another factor that counts against them getting on an aircraft.
Yeah, I'm sure you're like me. You've been listening to hundreds of webinars, it seems like. Unfortunately for me, most of them happen late at night. I've got one at 10 o'clock tonight, actually, I'm supposed to listen to. Everybody talks, and this kind of goes into what you were just talking about as well with leisure travel, but everybody's been talking about airlines or markets with good domestic business will come back faster, regional and international travel will come back slower. And then also, first of all, is that what you're seeing? Secondly, it's probably going to be business travel that comes first and then the leisure travel that comes later, right?
Yeah, well, let's look at some of the, I suppose, that the facts behind some of this. Obviously, China was the first to go into the lockdown, and it did see, or is seeing, a considerable amount of aircraft coming out of storage now and back into operation. So yes, the domestic network is a crucial part of China's economy and infrastructure anyway. But of course, China is a large country, so it does need air travel for those domestic routes. I suppose you look at a smaller country or region where there are other ways to travel, then they may be preferred rather than getting on an aircraft and having that whole sort of airport experience that we spoke about earlier. So yes, it's fairly logical that domestic and the regional travel will be the first to return, and of course that really plays into some of the areas that we look at in terms of aircraft utilization. That is increasing. However, the interesting facts that we're waiting to hear are really things about load factors and yields that are being achieved. We've seen anecdotal evidence of some very full aircraft, but we've also seen evidence of fairly light load factors. So I think this is a really critical stage for the airlines because many governments have supported airlines and had various furlough schemes for staff, but actually now the costs are going to start coming up because if they've been benefiting from payment holidays on leased aircraft, then those will be coming to an end. If the aircraft's starting to be used, then the lessor is going to want to see some rental being paid. So it really is a critical stage for a lot of the airlines. And I think the grounding of aircraft that we've seen, the announcement over here that British Airways was going to now permanently retire the 31 747-400s, that they were already earmarked to go out of service in the next 2 to 3 years in any case. But this really makes the decision for them that whole fleet can now be grounded because there's no real prospect of British Airways needing so much capacity on international travel. So it's with probably with a heavy heart that these decisions are being made. but it's a much better prospect to use the larger twin-engined aircraft rather than those the four-engined Queen of the Skies, as we refer to it.
I love the 747. It was the first big plane I ever really flew on, which actually brings up the question. I'm curious, the A380, even though the Airbus ended the program, said we're not, after we finish building what we are for Etihad or Emirates, that, that's it, we're going to shut down the production line, so on and so forth. People, and obviously Singapore Airlines has sent everything to Alice Springs, all the A380s in Australia. Do you think the A380 will fly again at all? Or has Emirates invested way too much money to leave it on the ground?
Well, I think that as a general rule, I think we're going to see airlines will now be looking at that whole cost of operation, and again those four-engine wide bodies are really expensive to get. The amount of resource needed to get that aircraft in the air, both in terms of fuel and the cabin crews, it's a huge resource required. So unless you're going to be filling those aircraft up with reasonable load factors, then it doesn't make sense to operate them. However, and it will be different according to what other capacity airlines have. If you mentioned some of those Middle East airlines, and in particular Emirates, well over 100 A380s. Clearly, I don't think they're going to be grounding all of theirs. But of course, the likes of Qantas have said they're putting theirs into storage for at least 3 years. And I'm not a betting man, but I would, if I was forced to make a decision, I'd be saying, I can't see those aircraft coming back into service. I would love to think that they are, because we are all emotionally involved with this industry. And I'd love to think that the markets recover well enough in 2 to 3 years' time that airlines will be clamoring to get 747s and A380s out of the desert. But I'm really struggling to see that scenario playing out.
Well, and that's interesting, because the longer this goes on, and the more I listen to everybody in the industry, the more negative is probably not the right word, but let's say cautious, very cautious about the future. On that note, earlier this month, one of your analysts was talking about the third quarter of this year would probably bring more airline failures. We've already seen Virgin Australia go under. Do you see this continuing? Where we sit right now, today's the 21st of July. Do you see that continuing? Are we going to see some more failures? I use the term bankruptcy. Others prefer administration. And where are we going to see that? Is it going to be Asia? Is it going to be Europe? And let's talk a little bit, if you can, about the government stepping in to save carriers, where we saw that in Hong Kong recently, and then also Singapore has put a big package together for SIA.
Yeah. Well, it's the nature of this pandemic, of course, is that it's all over the world, and it's in different phases depending where in the world you are. So it's unlike the previous downturns we've seen and other epidemics such as SARS and MERS. They've been largely contained, and therefore there have been options. Obviously, there were airline failures in those downturns, or there were airlines severely affected. But the difference now is I just think every region of the world is negatively impacted, and the cash is king in any business and probably in any situation. But a lot of the airlines have really been running almost hand to mouth in terms of that cash. And I think our analysis, where we were talking about the third quarter is going to be extremely tough, is to do with that airlines that may have got through this initial, whether it's going to be sort of 4 or 5 months, if you got through that, you then start to incur costs as you're reactivating aircraft, and as you're starting to do maintenance on aircraft. So I think there's it's going to impact cash even more severely than it's happened in terms of just storing aircraft and trying to mothball things. I think a lot of the airlines as well, there's been a reasonable amount of forbearance from lenders across the whole of the sector. So I'm not just talking about the aircraft financing. I think a lot of airport authorities were, giving airlines breaks in terms of parking fees, etc. So I think there's been a lot of support from everybody. Governments have been, I say, very supportive. I think there are so many differences between the way governments view airlines. Here I can understand why Singapore wants to protect its flag carrier. Hong Kong, Cathay, the flag carrier of Hong Kong is being protected. Over here, it is a strange situation because, of course, British Airways is the flag carrier, but we have Virgin Atlantic really looking for more support. It did get the package last week, of course, which was a combination of some new borrowings, some credit card charge, taking that into account in terms of lending, and shareholders put money in. There clearly wasn't a desire here for a government just to step in and save everything. We also there's big variations. We've seen the likes of Alitalia, of course, which has never been in a great financial position, being basically rescued yet again by the government. So it is rather strange. My concern is that it will create a lot of protectionism. I think there's one of the negative sides of this is, I think, a lot of countries and a lot of people, we're kind of, well, let's look after ourselves first now. And I think we're going to see governments where they can, they will step in, but they're not going to save every airline. So as I mentioned, if you're let's say a second or third level carrier, unless you are a flag carrier, then I suspect you'll really find it a problem to gain government support. So we've seen some airlines also going, to the unsecured debt market, and I think it was in the US, American have made some significant borrowings, but very expensive. I think that's over 10% interest they're paying. So there are options, but I think a lot of the issues for airlines, wherever they are in the world, is that they're not going to be immune from the effects of COVID, whether it's inbound traffic for tourism, whether it's the destinations that they're flying to imposing quarantine measures. And I do think that until there is a vaccine, then it's going to be a big uphill battle. And that really brings the conclusion that it's almost inevitable that there'll be, I would say, a lot more airline failures.
Let me jump in there real quick. Excuse me. Everybody kind of agrees that sort of the, quote, new normal for the industry, it's going to be a smaller industry. Capacity is going to be, and I have this in quote marks, rationalized. Airlines and OEMs are going to, and I hate this term that they use, but they're going to right-size their employee numbers, which means they're going to fire people. People are going to lose their jobs. And everybody also that has been talking on, again, the webinars that come late at night, that as we mentioned before, the 747s and the A380s are probably on their way out, or they're definitely on their way out. And everybody's looking at sort of the 787s and the A350s kind of becoming the backbone of long-haul travel, and the A320s and the 737 MAX, if and when it ever gets flying again, that's going to be, the narrow bodies of choice. Is that kind of what your data shows? Is that what IBA sees out there?
Yeah, again, in general terms, that is what's happening. But I think, again, it's going to depend on the choices that a particular airline has. So they'll be looking towards the largest aircraft in their fleet are going to be the most susceptible. And for some airlines, they may only have one type of aircraft. So if you're looking at we'd mentioned Emirates as an example that's heavily concentrated on the A380. It does, of course, have lots of other aircraft. It has some 777s, A330s, and the new generation kit as well. So it will be really looking to see, if it's going to downsize what other equipment it currently has, but also it's going to be looking at its order book and really looking at something like 777X that's hopefully not much more than a year away or 18 months away, but that's a separate issue, of course. Is do they actually take all of those on board now? They may be more fuel efficient, but they really need all of those aircraft according to their current skyline of deliveries, and it's going to be a balancing act because they could keep some of their older fleet going. Some of I think they have a number of A330s and 777s that are due off lease or were due to retire from their fleet in the coming year. But actually, it's now going to be a bit of a juggling act. Do they retire some of the older aircraft, or do they keep them going? There may be some maintenance spend, but at least they're not having to spend another $200 million on a 777X, for example. So I think that I suppose really what I'm saying is we all like to speak in general terms, but to use another term, the devil is in the detail. If an airline does have choice, then I think it will be looking at taking away the 4-engine wide bodies and putting the twin-engine wides on there. So say some airlines will have more flexibility than others. It does, I do see the A350 and 787 kind of tick that box in terms of, they are the most fuel efficient aircraft in their category right now. So, use them. But there's also a little bit about the environment. I know the environment probably goes onto the back burner, pardon the pun, at times like this. But I do think some of the government support packages we're seeing are coming along with sort of strings attached, which is you've either got to get rid of some of those older aircraft, or you've got to look towards the new technology, because there is still considerable pressure from lobbyists and governments in terms of that whole environmental issue, that it shouldn't get forgotten.
Yeah, let me jump in there. I mean, you bring up a really good point, because the ICAO just made it easier for airlines, basically made it easier for them to pollute by setting 2019 as the baseline for COSIA. So now all of the, everything so we don't have to count 2020 when nobody's flying. So, the carbon emission standards would have been a lot tougher. And that's interesting, because I was at the IATA general meeting in Seoul, South Korea, I think last year or the year before. And Tim Heffer from Reuters got involved into a little back and forth with Alexander Dejuniak, the Director General of IATA, and he was asking him, are you polluters? Are you polluters? Are you polluters? And Alexander got a little bit miffed that he was asking it in such a way. And to be fair to the industry, the figures that I see, it's anywhere from 2% to 4% of CO2 emissions worldwide, globally. So it's not the biggest polluter, but it is. And the interesting thing too is I see more airports going carbon neutral than I do airlines. Obviously, it's very hard, and I don't mean to ramble on and everything, but also because I actually did my master's thesis on the environment, and you have the airlines talking about sustainable fuel, and a big part of that sustainable fuel comes from palm oil, which, if you've ever been to Malaysia, I mean, it's one giant palm oil plantation, and they're cutting down old growth rainforests to plant palm oil. So I don't understand the logic of it sometimes.
Yeah, we could probably speak for another hour on this, Matt, because we did actually produce a report much earlier this year called really the environment and the impact, and it was particularly about aircraft finance. Because we know, a lot of banks and their corporate governance, they really want to get more involved in so-called green financing. But I do think that whole sustainable fuel story, I think that has improved somewhat. I don't think palm oil is really the ideal foundation for sustainable fuels. There's been a lot of work is going on to other sort of algae and other forms of microbes or fuel burning sources. So I think that would be fine. But in terms of the amount that would need to be produced to actually fly all aircraft with sustainable fuel just isn't going to happen. So I think I think the industry takes a bit of a kick, but I suppose we might need to reset it now with the COVID situation, is that whilst it may only be 2, 3 or 4% of world carbon emissions right now, the growth story of aviation over the next 20 years was going to become more like 30% of carbon emissions. So whereas a lot of other industries have a plan and a strategy to reduce their carbon emissions, whether that's construction, marine, industrial processes. They all seem to have some sort of plan that can be put into place within a few years. Aviation, things, the technology just doesn't change that rapidly. There's no feasible way right now of having an electric powered wide body aircraft. You might be able to do it on some very short haul stuff, but the electrical engineering technology just isn't there in terms of the larger aircraft types. So we have seen, and actually it does bother me in terms of some of the investment that's required. British Airways had actually put a lot of investment into research, firstly into sustainable fuels, but also hydrogen technology, because I think there's a lot of the experts say that the wide body fuel of choice is probably hydrogen. It's going to take a decade to even get to the next stage, but that needs an awful lot of investment, and that needs governments, that needs airlines and OEMs to step up. But right now, which airline is going to say that's a priority, and which OEM? The OEMs are hurting so much that it's really going to be tough to continue down that path.
Well, let me jump in there, because I'm actually we're running short on time, so I want to get to a couple of other things. But I do want to do a couple of things. One, I would like to come back and talk to you sometime about the environment and highlight that report, because I'd be very interested in that. That's an area that I'm particularly interested in. Secondly, what could go wrong with hydrogen and aviation? I mean, that the Hindenburg comes to mind. But I have my doubts about hydrogen and aviation. I just do not think that's a good mix. That's my own personal opinion. Thirdly, you talked about OEMs hurting right now. Let's talk about very quickly, because we are running out of time, MROs, OEMs. Everybody knows what Boeing's going through. Everybody knows what Airbus is going through. Everybody's laid off people. They either pause production or cut back on production or still cut back on production. Boeing's had problems with the MAX. They had some problems with the Dreamliners as well, with some foreign object debris, different things like that, not just on the commercial side, on the defense side as well. Spirit, Aerosystems, laid off people, etc. Is anybody going to come out of this unscathed? Are the lessors going to make more money? Or, what's going to happen? Who's better positioned to survive these things?
I think you do touch on some points there, obviously some pre-COVID issues, but I think it's important just to, my personal view is that the supply chain was already creaking. The production rates that Airbus and Boeing have increased over the last decade have really pushed the whole of that supply chain to the limits. And my personal view is that it's stretched organizations in terms of the technology. It's stretched, which is great. That's good that we're stretching ourselves, of course. But actually, mistakes happen. Production processes may not be 100%. Quality inspection systems break down. And actually, we don't want that happening. Obviously, safety is paramount in our industry. So I think the things that we saw with the MAX, clearly a tragedy, 340 odd people killed in 2 separate accidents. That's the worst case scenario. If you were ever doing a risk assessment of an industry, you'd be saying you've got to be safe. And then if you then look through some of those other issues, you mentioned some of the other issues, 787s and the Trent engine issues that Rolls-Royce are still having, the investment required from the OEMs to keep that continuous airworthiness management going is huge. These are billion-dollar programs. So in terms of getting that right, I do think one of the upsides that maybe this downturn is giving us is a chance to think, a chance to catch up and look at some of those production processes, some of the technology, and just making sure that it is absolutely 100%. So meanwhile, I do think, the OEMs have really got to look at those delivery schedules. They must be, calls every day from operators saying, look, we just want to defer the orders. Yeah. And that's going to be a massive issue. And it's not just Boeing and Airbus. You've mentioned Spirit. This industry, isn't just about them. There's thousands of suppliers and vendors, the interior manufacturers and suppliers. Everybody is hurting. And I do expect that we're going to see some casualties in that supply chain, which will have a knock-on effect into the production rates as well. That does sound a lot of gloom and doom, but meanwhile, you look at how the investors are still happy to put, unsecured, get into unsecured debt deals with some of the lessors. We see AerCap and ALC successfully raising money over the last few weeks. So I think there's still some positives for investors. Ultimately, every industry and every sector has been really shaken by this COVID situation, and that actually means fundamentally an aircraft is a mobile asset. It's generally US dollar denominated, and it's a long-term asset. So maybe I'm doing a conclusion here already, Matt, but despite all of this, very, very tough times, I still think that the sector attracts investors. And there will be needed, the changes will be needed in terms of, well, okay, what happens if there's COVID-20? What happens if there's COVID-21? Financing and leasing is going to be shaken as well. And there's going to have to be more ways to account for this flexibility required in the future.
Well, I think, and again, yeah, we kind of got to the conclusion of this, which is good because I'm running out of time. We always try to keep these to about 30 minutes. But yeah, I mean, that is the positive note that the industry will survive. And as you said, people are going to, and there's money to be made. Although actually I was listening to a webinar and the guy said that if you looked at from the day the Wright brothers flew their first airplane to today, that the aviation industry had not made money on a net basis.
Yeah.
He said if you look at the whole history of aviation, it's not profitable. You know, some years are profitable, some years are not, but taken as a whole, it's not profitable. But people are still willing to put money in it. Is that the positive thing that we can take away from all this?
Yeah, and you reminded me actually that IATA, I think on their economics pages somewhere, it's a great reminder that this industry, or rather, let's say the airlines as investment grades, that's really only happened in the last 8 or 9 years. It's a recent phenomenon that the industry has actually made money. So I suppose really what I do say to some of the younger members of our team, our analysts, is that don't think that it's all been milk and honey in this aviation world, and it's not. Things aren't always on the up, but actually that's kind of our industry as battles through. Aircraft will soon need to be maintained, and hopefully some of these MROs will get back to doing their jobs. But actually, on the face of it, we've been a growth industry for the last 5 decades, and actually that will continue. But it may just be a little bit of a reality check that airlines have a tough job to make money. And so I'll just finish off, Matt, by saying this is a US dollar industry. So I think airlines that have been earning US dollars have been the ones who have been investment grade. You talk to a lot of airlines where their revenues are local currency, which is taking a hammering against the dollar, then, and that's kind of almost the rest of the world with the way that the dollar's been performing over the last few years. You look at some of the South American currencies dropped 40, 50% against the dollar in the last few years. A lot of the issues I think we've had in the UK following the Brexit vote 4 years ago have been because sterling has dropped 25 or 20%. And the airlines are still tied in with 10-year lease rentals that they negotiated 5 years ago. And that's a story around the world. I think it's still going to be very tough for airlines, but these are still mobile assets, and I think the industry in general is still very much investors still seem to like our industry.
Good. We're out of time. Phil Seymour, president of IBA, thanks for joining me in conversation.
Pleasure, Matt. Thanks for the invitation.